Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we'll discuss the results of the U.S. election and the collapse of the German government coalition. We hope you enjoy the show. Let's start with the biggest news, I think, this week everywhere in the world, which is the results of the U.S. election.
Yeah, all the work and all the thinking that has been put into what would a second Trump administration mean for Europe, all that think tank work, all that brain power, it turned out that that wasn't wasted.
As I'm sure our listeners know, President Donald Trump, and now President-elect again, has won both the Electoral College and probably the popular vote.
A lot of the sentiment heading into the final days of the election seemed to be trending in Harris's direction. Part of me was thinking, man, all that work people have done thinking about what a second Trump administration looked like, that's all for naught, all totally wasted. And it turned out that Trump had what was a very decisive victory. I think it sort of plays into the trend of incumbents doing very poorly, not just in Europe, but really around the world. You know, if you think about the Modi government in India having a real electoral setback. And part of me thought that this trend might be slightly overrated, especially when we think about Europe. Oftentimes, Europe is pointed to as sort of an example of an anti-incumbent dynamic. Matt Iglesias had a piece in the New York Times just before the election talking about this. And I was like, well, Northern European governments that were led by social democratic parties in Sweden and Finland both lost, but each of those parties actually gained votes last year. And, the European parliamentary elections actually was sort of a victory for the center, and the far right didn't do quite well. And even in France, well, there's a 60-40 anti-far right coalition that has just sort of stayed intact. The pieces have sort of moved around. And yeah, UK was anti-Tory and it was a big defeat. But on the other hand, that's been like 14 years in coming. But here, it really looks like this was a real anti-incumbent mood in the United States, and it has ushered in a Donald Trump victory. And surprisingly enough, it looks like also a popular vote victory. And it looks like Donald Trump has gotten a bigger margin than any Republican since the Reagan administration. So he's going to come into office. And I think what is very different about this time than in 2016, and in 2016, I was in the State Department and, found out on election night that I was about to lose my job. But what's different now is that there's a lot of planning and thinking about what they're going to be doing in the world. And I think it's going to have big ramifications for our region, for Europe, Russia, and particularly Ukraine.
Yeah, 100%. I think there is a lot of, I would say, literature out there for possible plans under a second Trump administration, including from obviously a lot of Trump-aligned organizations and think tanks, I guess. The question mark for me is, does that get implemented? I mean, it could be, but it could be that he also completely throws the book and does something completely different that we weren't expecting because that's the flavor of the day, because that's the head of state that he had on the phone that morning. So we have more guidelines than last time, that's for sure. There's a lot more thinking. We know he's going to come into this administration with people who are much more closely aligned with his view and who are more ready to implement what he wants to do versus last time, where there was really very clear factions between a traditional Republican part of the administration and more of a quote-unquote MAGA part of the administration, and this time it's all MAGA.
Yeah, so you'll hear a lot of talk from Europeans about Trump's a deal maker, and we'll just, sort of go in and cut a deal with him, and that's how we'll sort of get through this and mitigate some of the problems. And perhaps that may be true, perhaps on trade issues, and we can talk about that. But I think what that sort of misunderstands is that there's sort of a plan and a vision now. And I think Europeans look back on the first Trump term and say, well, it wasn't that bad, and we were able to strike a deal over tariffs and prevent a trade war from getting out of control, and that's true. And look, he wasn't that bad on security. But I think what that really misunderstands is really how the American system works. Yes, the president has a lot of power and a lot of control. But what really matters, I think this is particularly true on the NATO and security side, the president's not micromanaging this. So you're coming to Trump to make a deal. Well, who's implementing that deal? And what happened was that when you had Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, they strongly supported NATO. And, we've talked about this, that the bureaucracy in the state and defense departments very much want to maintain American primacy in Europe and America's sort of preeminent role in calling the shots in European security. And that was there in the first Trump administration. But what you have now will be a Trump administration that's likely going to come in and be staffed with people at these various agencies that actually want to change change things, that want to actually change that, to reduce America's role in Europe, to shift the responsibility of European security from the United States to Europe. And that we haven't seen in 75 years. And they want to do that. And that's like part of the plan. And I think that's going to happen. And so Europeans coming and trying to various European countries being like, we'll just cut a deal with Trump. Maybe you will. But I think there's a plan to really shift U.S. support for NATO, U.S. presence in NATO. Doesn't mean to end U.S. involvement in NATO, but I think they mean what they say. And Trump has been very consistent about how he sees NATO as not a good deal for the United States and a racket. And he has been consistent about that since he emerged in public life in the 1980s. So this is not some loosely held view. The difference is that the first term, he would say these things and then have people that would not implement it. This time, he will say these things and he has people that not only will implement it, but have thought about how they're going to implement Trump's vision vis-a-vis Europe. And I think that is going to hopefully prompt a real reaction within Europe.
Yeah, I think there's, in some parts of Europe, there's what I can only term as wishful positivity around this, around the deal making, all of this. To me, it's not only that he'll have people who will implement his vision, it's also that if you're a European leader, you get some kind of commitment or, verbal agreement from him one day. Nothing guarantees that this sticks. That's something that we saw in the first Trump administration when Macron tried to save the Paris Accords. He thought he had managed it, and then a few months later, Trump took the U.S. out of it. So you can't rely on what he tells you that day. You have to look at what he's been saying on the campaign trail, the things that, as you were saying on NATO, for example, are consistent throughout his first term, throughout his life, and everything he said about those things. The usual thing, if they show you who they are, believe them. So there needs to be a very harsh realism in some of these European capitals. I think we saw that, for example, from Charles Michel, who congratulated the president, but also said Europe needs to step up. This is the time. And these are conversations that were, I think, rhetorical in the months before the election, because they were still, I think, holding on to the possibility that it would be a Harris administration. But now we're on the doorstep of it. It has to be, okay, did we mean it? Did we mean it when we said we have to take a bigger role in our own future, in our own security? And that's what Charles Michel was talking about.
I think the other huge implication here, so there's the NATO side, but also Ukraine. I think Ukraine had the most to lose in this election, despite the brave face that I think Zelensky is really putting on. But I do not really see a path for another supplemental appropriation for Ukraine. I hope I am wrong about that, but I would be in some ways shocked that full Republican control will pass a Ukraine supplemental. Now, maybe they will, maybe it'll be much less, but this is where the Trump proofing of Ukraine and what sort of really frustrates me is that Europeans had been thinking Trump was going to win for not just the last week or the last 2 months. Maybe they were hopeful the last week that Trump wouldn't win, but they were thinking Trump was going to win a year ago when Joe Biden was still on the ballot. And the time to act to Trump-proof Ukraine was last year. And where we are now is that, let's say tomorrow, the EU or other European countries act to allocate a ton more money for Ukraine. Well, there has not really been an adequate defense industrial ramp up, and Europeans are basically running out of military equipment. And the US is the major military backer of Ukraine. And without that aid, it's hard to see how Ukraine can hold on. And we just ran an experiment last year and this year. What would happen if the US sort of turned off the tap? And the answer was that Ukraine begins to really lose the war. And there was no European backfilling there. So the concern I have is that Europe has been twiddling its thumbs, not reckoning with the fiscal demands that come with supporting a country that's in the midst of a major conventional industrial war that's in Europe, but it's got to act now and then figure out a way to buy time over the next year to keep Ukraine alive. And the problem that I see is this notion that Trump's going to try to negotiate a deal on day one. And it's not that he's not going to do that. It's that Russia is not going to oblige, because Russia is going to look at this and say, we are going to win this war. Why would we negotiate? We're not going to agree to a ceasefire. It's over. The Americans aren't going to provide the funding and the Europeans are going to twiddle their thumbs. We've won this, another year of fighting, and we'll squeeze them. And oh, by the way, the U.S. is going to take the foot off the gas on the sanctions pressure. And then when they do that, then that means the Europeans are going to do the same. Suddenly the light at the end of the tunnel for Moscow has gotten really bright. So I think Europe has not just a military crisis because its military forces are not strong and its military forces can't operate and work together. And they've never really thought about that because it's all been relying on the US being the kind of backbone of European defense. They have that problem, and they have the problem of Ukraine potentially losing this war. And both require dramatic action like 6 months ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. And I think this has to be sort of priority number one for Europe. One more thought is that there's going to be no Russia policy, I think, from a Trump administration. No one wants to work on Russia. Trump-Russia advisors, I doubt there's going to be a Fiona Hill in this next administration. And it's not a topic that experts in the field really want to work with Trump on. So I think that is an area where Europe is going to be somewhat on its own when it comes to deterring the kind of hybrid asymmetric warfare that is right now taking place inside of Europe. And I think that's going to get dialed up, and Europe is going to have to figure out a way to deter that. And Europe is going to be in the lead in having a Russia policy. Good times.
I'll be really interested to see what that looks like. I feel like there's two paths in front. Remembering the conversation we had with Mitch from Eurasia Group, where he was saying Trump is the shock Europe needs to really unify. So that's one path. This really is a shock to the system because, yes, they were preparing for Trump-ish, but they had this hope kind of that it would not go that way. Now they have to get their ducks in a row. That's one option. That means significant changes in integration, in defense spending, all of that. What I worry about is the other path, which is obsession with the idea of Trump as a deal maker. I can get my thing if I go and kiss the ring at Mar-a-Lago, whatever. And that's when you start seeing a complete disintegration of that European unity, where every leader does their own thing bilaterally and tries to get concession for their own interests. So that's, Germany trying to extract concessions around anything that has to do with their trade with China or things like that. I mean, Viktor Orban already has his own direct line to the incoming presidency, obviously, but that's the really concerning path. That disintegration, not making the significant changes that need to happen at the EU level, in Brussels, in the institutions, and continuing to see that disintegration, I think, is really concerning to me.
Yeah, I think the big internal challenge for the European Union, you could say this about every single crisis. As Jean Monnet said, Europe is forged through crisis. And I tend to be the EU optimist, that when there's a crisis, the European Union figures out to stick together. And, when Brexit happened, the UK's entire strategy was we're going to divide and conquer. We're going to pick them apart. And that is what the EU has to be on guard for. Particularly, Hungary is a key example. But it does strike me that with the change in kind of, especially on the European People's Party, with, Viktor Orban's party being kicked out, and now there's a new alternative option in Hungary that has emerged and perhaps has taken the lead in the polls. Now's the time for the EU to play real hardball with any potential country that is seeking to break cohesion. And I don't quite know what those tools are. Dan Kellerman has been doing a lot of thinking, but this is where really holding back a lot of funding, holding back money aggressively, being hard edge about countries that are thinking about defecting or breaking unity in negotiations, also in opposing things. And, I think the EU might have to be willing to sort of take really dramatic steps that maybe work around Hungary or work around countries that aren't willing to participate, and just be like, if you're not with us, then you're getting off the train. Now, there's no real way of kicking them out of the EU, but basically figuring out a way to move forward without them and doing that again and again and again. And ultimately, that I think is not where a number of countries want to be. The big problem is that this is coming at a point where there's a leadership vacuum in Berlin. The German government literally just collapsed, something that we've been talking about again and again. It was probably time, but what a time. And then this, the urgency of the moment, but Olaf Scholz isn't going to call a vote of confidence until January, and then elections aren't going to be until March. And so is the EU going to lose all the kind of crisis momentum? We'll see. Also Macron, this is, I think, a moment where he's sort of emerged from the dead, it seems like, but he's not in the best political place. I mean, this is really where I think Poland can really play, I think, a strong role. There's been a lot of talk about the Eastern Europeans and power shifting eastward, but the way power shifts eastward is if you assert it at the European level. And now with Kaja Kallas and with Poland, to me, it's really the Eastern Europeans and the Nordics should assert that this is about European security. And it is going to be non-negotiable on anything else unless we are taking really bold action. More money at the EU level, more money on defense. This is we have to do this. And if we're not doing this, then screw everything else. And I think the Eastern Europeans can prioritize this and want to prioritize this. With Kubilius from Lithuania as the new defense commissioner, there's a real opportunity there, I think, for Eastern Europe to take the lead on Europe becoming a stronger security actor.
Yeah, and since you mentioned Germany, maybe we can turn to that. But potentially that could be an opening. That could be Scholz's decision to sack Lindner and get himself into really troubled waters with the coalition up for a confidence vote in January, etc. Could that be his messaging where there's an opening for those Eastern Europeans, for those Northern Europeans to ally with each other and push a Berlin government that's really on the edge, but potentially Scholz saying the reason he wanted to do this is we are facing a lot of crises and Christian Lindner has not been a positive actor. I mean, some of the stuff he said were pretty harsh, but also I think pretty honest, and the outpouring of probably a lot of accumulated frustration that Scholz had about his own coalition. Could that be an opening to say, we know we need to do more. We haven't been doing it. We've been trying, but a coalition, the way it was formed, is preventing us from doing that. Let's try to move forward. Now's the time to put some policies on the table.
Yeah, I think it was a long time coming. And like Christian Lindner of the FDP, of the kind of liberal party, adopted incredibly conservative orthodox approach toward fiscal policy, which has sort of been baked into German politics and economics for a long time. And this is where, Germany basically has a balanced budget amendment. And, the precise issue was like Scholz was pushing him that we need to make an exception for support for Ukraine, means you can make this sort of emergency crisis exception. And he refused. So in some ways, that's probably a good issue for Scholz to, in some ways, break the coalition because it's over Ukraine. But I think this is an election that is needed because the German government has been totally stuck and Scholz hasn't really been able to chart a path forward in this coalition. My guess is that if he remains the leader of the SPD going into the elections, which is not guaranteed, SPD's hope is that they can rebound back to 20%. And if you look at the polling, the CDU is sort of above 30%. And, there were all these concerns about this sort of far right and far left wave in regional elections that happened earlier this fall. We talked about them. You look at the polling now, and it's like the AfD may get around 16%. That's, around where they have been in the last few elections, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But the AfD is around 15, 16%. And to me, what we're hoping for as an outsider that wants to have a functioning German government able to provide leadership at a European level is the CDU is almost definitely going to get above 30%. And so you need either the Greens or the SPD to get to 20%. And you would right now say the SPD is closer, but I think this is going to be a very dynamic election. And what I was sort of thinking was like, why are the Greens staying in this coalition when they could be the change agent? And I think, Robert Habeck is a very charismatic figure. My German isn't good enough to really track the ins and outs. I think he's got some challenges of obviously implementing a lot of the green agenda, then cause backlash. On the other hand, in a dynamic election where voters are generally unhappy, where I think he can point the blame both at Scholz and others, like I could see the Greens rising. Again, they're not trying to get 50% of the vote. It's not like you're Kamala Harris and you're like, man, if I could hit Trump on terrorists, but then I might lose the union vote. And then, you're trying to piece together to get above 50%. If you're trying to get 20%, you can sort of live and breathe your values, I would think. And I think you could maybe get close to 20%. We'll see how the SPD runs. But I think it's time for this election. The problem is it's going to drag out until March, which isn't that far away. So my hope is that there's going to be sort of a minority government between now and that maybe there's room to do some bold things. I mean, this is like no one's expecting that because no way the German government could do anything bold. But maybe this is the moment where actually crisis, German leadership, and you just sort of run with it. But we'll see.
Yeah, the note you made on the Greens is definitely something that came to mind when I heard Habeck's remarks after Scholz's decision, which were also quite harsh about the FDP and Lindner. So you can tell Habeck is, I'm sure, also had genuine frustration with what was happening, but also positioning himself to say, here are all my issues with how we've run this. And some of the things he was saying feels like pre-campaign already. But it made me wonder, exactly as you said, like, can they run as the party that was trying to hold on to its values in a coalition that made that difficult? Because they're not polling great, but also last time we thought they were going to have the chancellorship and Scholz just emerged out of nowhere in the last 2 months of the campaign. So nothing is a given. I think the big question mark for me on what happens before then is, can the CDU give a little on things like Ukraine? Can they set aside the prize that they, I think, I'm sure, are seeing at the end of this tunnel of coming back into power? Can they decide that giving some concessions and working with Scholz on at least Ukraine, like the rest you can decide later, but that won't hurt their chances too much, or they're not giving too much to the governing coalition? Would they let that go?
So I think the German economy, it's in a terrible place. And the way I tend to think of German political movements is that Germany appears impossible to move, impossible to shift. It's like you're talking to a brick wall, and then suddenly everything changes. The next minute, the Germans are like, oh yeah, we've completely changed. We're totally in this direction now. And we've seen that on energy policy, the next gen EU that suddenly Merkel supported after a decade of utterly opposing the concept. I think the problem now for Germany is that if you have tariffs coming from the US and you are in kind of a bad trade spot with China, you have to look internally at the European market. And that requires really trying to work hard to revive European growth. And my big question about Germany is that when we think about the history of European integration, the moments where it accelerated was, obviously after World War II, where you had West Germany trying to rehabilitate itself, and the way to do that was through Europe. Then after the wall fell and Germany was focused on reunification and therefore did whatever it took to get Europe to accept that, even if that meant getting rid of the Deutschmark and creating the European Union and moving forward on European integration. The question now is, was that just an aberration? And that Germany is actually very Germany first and very German centric? Or is this a crisis in which Germany again realizes that it has to turn to Europe and it needs Europe because it itself, its export model doesn't work anymore? And we'll see. But it does strike me that the CDU is the party that could actually bring about the economic change and has the clout and the credibility with the kind of German economic business community to be like, this whole Schwarz-Null, the whole balanced budget, that was actually a really terrible idea. They have a ton of fiscal space that they could be using to invest in their economy, supporting Ukraine, doing tons of things. And the question is, will they do that? Number one. And then two, will they look for European solutions as well? I mean, simply reviving the German economy would be great for European growth. But then if Europe begins to take other steps, as outlined in the Draghi report of capital markets union, having, God forbid, the EU issuing a safe asset, i.e. debt, then you could really revive growth within the European project. Will we get there? We'll see. I mean, we're now going to have to wait till March, but it'll be interesting how this election plays out. But I would kind of hope that these issues begin to percolate through the German economy because, the FDP has no vision, I think, for how they would revive the German economy. What's also astonishing to me is that you have the Liberal Party that has become immigration hawks, which I guess now everyone has to be. But I would think that the Liberal Party that's for reducing barriers and like free trade and openness would be pro-immigration. But so what's the difference between them and the CDU, I think is a big challenge. And part of the reason why Lindner, I think, is breaking the coalition is to just hopefully keep the FDP in the parliament. I think what's pretty clear is the next few weeks and months are going to be really fascinating in Europe, also here in Washington, and European relations are about to go through a really tumultuous period, which I think could be positive in Europe. Actually, there could be some real benefits, but we'll have to see how things play out when the Trump administration begins to take office, who's going to be at these agencies, and then whether Europe can actually maintain its cohesion and treats this like a crisis where everyone needs to be aligned. Or is everyone going to sort of run off and do their own thing?
Yeah, I think that's probably a great place to leave it for this quick reaction to very fast-moving events. So we'll be back soon.
And if you're interested, you can go and read a report we did back in January of last year about how Europe would react to a Trump administration. It's now, dusted off, and there's going to be a lot of thinking about this going forward here at CSIS. So that's it for today's episode. And as always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. We're also going to be talking about what a new Trump administration means for Russia and Ukraine in more depth on that podcast, so please check that out. Our thanks to our producer, Shannon Young, and to Otto Svensson and Essie Pekkanen for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.